"Get this homeless-looking kid out of business class," she whispered to security, thinking I couldn't hear. 3 minutes later, the pilot was personally apologizing to me over the intercom while she packed her bags. You're about to discover what happens when assumptions meet reality at 35,000 feet and why judging someone by their appearance can cost you everything. Buckle up. This flight is about to take an unexpected turn. Boston Logan International Airport was buzzing with the usual pre-flight chaos at 6:30 a.m. on a crisp Tuesday morning in October. The autumn air carried that familiar scent of jet fuel and anticipation that every frequent traveler knew by heart. Among the sea of business travelers in tailored suits and designer luggage, one figure stood out, but not for the reasons you'd expect. Chen moved through the terminal with quiet confidence, despite his unconventional appearance that seemed to clash with everything around him. At 24, he looked like any college student traveling home for the holidays, or perhaps a young backpacker embarking on an adventure to somewhere exotic and far away. His dark hoodie was well-worn but clean, the kind of comfortable garment that spoke of countless study sessions and weekend adventures rather than board meetings and business dinners. His jeans had seen better days, with subtle fading at the knees and slight fraying at the cuffs that suggested they were chosen for comfort rather than style. His canvas backpack looked like it had survived multiple cross-country adventures, with patches from various national parks and universities creating a colorful mosaic of experiences and memories. The only hint of anything unusual was the first-class boarding pass he held carefully in his hand, treating it with the same casual respect he might show any important document.
As he approached Gate 15, Marcus noticed the subtle but unmistakable reactions from other passengers waiting in the departure lounge. Some curious glances that lingered just a moment too long, a few raised eyebrows from well-dressed business travelers who seemed puzzled by his presence, and more than one person doing a double-take at the stark contrast between his casual appearance and the premium boarding pass that was clearly visible in his hand. He was used to it by now, having experienced similar reactions countless times before. Growing up in a working-class family had taught him the value of humility and hard work, lessons that had shaped his character in ways that no amount of money could ever change. Even after his circumstances had changed dramatically over the years, he still preferred comfort over flash, substance over show, authenticity over pretense. The gate area was filled with the typical first-class crowd, a carefully curated collection of people who clearly belonged to the upper echelons of society. Business executives in expensive suits that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries were checking their phones constantly, their fingers flying across screens as they managed deals and communications that could affect thousands of people. Well-dressed families with matching luggage sets that screamed coordination and planning were organizing their documents and discussing their travel itineraries in hushed, cultured tones. Elderly couples who clearly belonged to the frequent flyer elite were settling into comfortable chairs with the practiced ease of people who had done this dance thousands of times before. Their platinum status cards displayed prominently in leather holders that had been gifts from the airlines themselves. Marcus found a seat in the corner, away from the main flow of foot traffic, but with a good view of the boarding gate. He pulled out a worn paperback book, its pages yellowed with age and multiple readings, and began to read while waiting for boarding to begin. The book was a classic work of philosophy, something that would have surprised the people around him if they had bothered to look closely enough to see the title. He could feel eyes on him occasionally, the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations that he had learned to ignore over the years. Some people seemed genuinely puzzled by his presence, while others appeared to be making mental calculations about how someone who looked like him could afford to be in this exclusive waiting area. Flight 247 to Los Angeles was operated by Skyline Airways, one of the most prestigious airlines in the country and a company with a reputation that had been built over decades of exceptional service and unwavering attention to detail. Known for their impeccable service and luxury amenities that rivaled the finest hotels in the world, they catered to a very specific clientele, the kind of people who expected perfection and had both the money and the influence to demand it. Their first-class cabins were legendary in the industry, featuring seats that converted to fully flat beds, gourmet meals prepared by world-renowned chefs, and service that anticipated passengers' needs before they even knew they had them, which made Marcus's presence all the more noticeable to those around him who understood the unspoken social hierarchies that governed these exclusive spaces. When boarding finally began, with the familiar announcement that had been refined over years of customer feedback and focus groups, Marcus waited patiently for the first-class announcement, reading his book and occasionally glancing up to observe the controlled chaos of people organizing their belongings and preparing for departure. As Zone 1 was called with the kind of ceremonial importance that airlines reserved for their most valued customers, he stood up slowly, shouldered his backpack with practiced ease, and joined the small group of premium passengers making their way to the boarding gate. That's when he first encountered Sarah Mitchell, and that encounter would change both of their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. Sarah had been with Skyline Airways for 12 long years, a tenure that had seen her rise through the ranks from a nervous new hire to one of the most respected members of the cabin crew. She was proud of her position as senior flight attendant, a role she had earned through years of dedicated service, countless hours of additional training, and an unwavering commitment to maintaining the airline's high standards that had made Skyline Airways synonymous with excellence in the minds of travelers around the world. At 38, she was known among her colleagues for her attention to detail that bordered on perfectionism, her ability to spot potential problems before they escalated into actual crises, and her encyclopedic knowledge of company policies and procedures that had been refined over decades of operation. She took particular pride in ensuring that the first-class cabin maintained its exclusive atmosphere, something she considered not just part of her job, but a sacred trust that had been placed in her hands by the company and its most valued customers. In her mind, the first-class experience was about more than just comfortable seats and good food. It was about creating an environment where successful, accomplished people could relax and conduct business without the distractions and inconveniences that plagued other parts of the aircraft. She had seen what happened when standards slipped, how quickly the exclusive atmosphere could be disrupted by people who didn't understand or respect the unspoken rules that govern these spaces. As Marcus approached the boarding gate, Sarah's trained eye immediately assessed him with the kind of systematic evaluation that she had perfected over years.
Experience dealing with all types of passengers. The worn clothing that looked like it had come from a discount retailer rather than the upscale stores that most first-class passengers frequented. The casual backpack that seemed more appropriate for a camping trip than business travel. The youthful appearance that suggested someone who might not yet have achieved the kind of success that typically afforded first-class accommodations. Everything about him seemed out of place among the first-class passengers, like a puzzle piece that had been forced into the wrong section of a complex picture. She had seen this before, unfortunately more often than she cared to admit, people trying to sneak into premium cabins with fake boarding passes that they had somehow obtained or created. Others hoping to take advantage of some confusion during the boarding process, perhaps claiming that there had been a last-minute upgrade that hadn't been properly documented. Some passengers even tried to simply walk into first class in hope that no one would notice or challenge them until the aircraft was already in flight and it would be too difficult to do anything about it. It was her job, her responsibility, to maintain order and ensure that only legitimate first-class passengers occupied those expensive seats that represented such a significant investment for the people who had paid for them. Marcus handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, a cheerful woman in her 20s who seemed genuinely happy to be helping passengers start their journeys. She scanned the pass without any hesitation or concern, her computer system immediately confirming his reservation and seat assignment. She welcomed him aboard with a warm smile that suggested she had been well trained in customer service and genuinely enjoyed her work. But as he walked down the jet bridge, that enclosed walkway that connected the terminal to the aircraft and always seemed to amplify the sounds of rolling luggage and nervous conversations, Sarah was waiting just inside the aircraft door, her professional smile in place, but her eyes sharp and assessing as they took in every detail of his appearance and demeanor. She watched as he entered the cabin and turned left toward the first-class section, her suspicions immediately confirmed by what she interpreted as presumptuous behavior. In her experience, people who belonged in first class moved with a certain confidence, a sense of belonging that came from years of experience in these exclusive environments. They knew where to go and how to behave because this was their world, their natural habitat. This young man's movements seemed tentative, uncertain, like someone who was trying to navigate unfamiliar territory without a map or guide. The first-class cabin of Flight 247 was a study in luxury and comfort that had been designed by teams of experts who understood both the practical needs of air travel and the psychological desires of wealthy passengers. 20 seats arranged in a spacious configuration that maximized both comfort and privacy, each offering amenities that most people could only dream of experiencing. Every seat could convert to a fully flat bed at the touch of a button, perfect for sleeping during long flights or simply relaxing in complete comfort. Premium amenities included noise-canceling headphones, luxury bedding, and personal entertainment systems with screens large enough to make watching movies a genuinely enjoyable experience. The passengers were already settling in with the practiced efficiency of people who traveled frequently and knew exactly how to make themselves comfortable in these luxurious surroundings. They were storing their belongings in the overhead compartments that could accommodate even the largest carry-on bags, organizing their personal items in the generous storage spaces provided at each seat, and accepting welcome drinks from the cabin crew who moved through the cabin with practiced grace and professional warmth. The atmosphere was one of quiet sophistication, exactly the environment that Sarah worked hard to maintain and protect from any disruptions or inconveniences that might interfere with the premium experience that these passengers had paid handsomely to enjoy. Marcus made his way to seat 3A, a window seat in the second row that offered an excellent view and easy access to the aisle without the potential disturbances that sometimes came with seats located closer to high-traffic areas. As he began to stow his backpack in the overhead compartment, taking care not to disturb the expensive luggage that was already neatly arranged there, Sarah approached him with purposeful steps that suggested she was prepared to handle whatever situation might arise. Her smile was professional but strained, the kind of expression that experienced service workers learn to maintain even when dealing with difficult or problematic situations. And her voice carried just enough authority to make nearby passengers glance in their direction with curiosity about what might be developing. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone polite but firm, in the way that experienced flight attendants learn to project authority without seeming aggressive or confrontational. "I think there might be some confusion about your seating assignment." Marcus paused in his movements and turned to face her, his expression calm and patient in a way that suggested he had dealt with similar situations before, though perhaps not quite as publicly or with so many witnesses.
"I don't think so," he replied quietly, his voice carrying a note of respectful certainty that indicated he was confident in his position but not looking for confrontation. "Seat 3A, right here." He held up his boarding pass for her to see, the document clearly showing his name, flight number, and seat assignment in the unmistakable format that airlines use to prevent exactly this kind of confusion. But Sarah barely glanced at the boarding pass, her mind already made up about the situation based on her initial assessment of Marcus and her years of experience dealing with what she perceived to be similar problems. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your identification and verify your booking," she continued, her voice growing slightly louder as she became more confident in her position and more determined to resolve what she saw as a clear case of someone trying to take advantage of the system. "We've had some issues lately with people trying to upgrade themselves without proper authorization," she added, her words carrying an implicit accusation that hung in the air between them like an invisible barrier. The nearby passengers were now openly watching the exchange, their conversations dying away as they focused on this unexpected drama unfolding in their usually serene first-class environment. Some watched with curiosity, others with obvious annoyance at the disruption to their pre-flight routine, and a few with the kind of righteous satisfaction that came from witnessing someone getting caught in the act.
Seeing rules being enforced and order being maintained, Marcus remained calm, his years of experience in difficult situations serving him well, as he reached into his wallet to produce the identification that Sarah had requested. "Here you go," he said, handing over his driver's license along with his boarding pass. Both documents crisp and official in a way that should have immediately resolved any questions about his legitimacy. Sarah took both documents, but instead of examining them carefully as any reasonable person would do when presented with official identification, she held them at arm's length, as if they might somehow contaminate her with whatever deception she was convinced they represented. "These could be fake," she announced, after what could only be described as a cursory glance that lasted no more than a few seconds, certainly not long enough to properly examine the security features that modern identification documents contain to prevent exactly this kind of fraud. "We see this all the time. Young people thinking they can outsmart the system and sneak into first class with forged documents and elaborate schemes." Her voice was now loud enough that passengers throughout the cabin could hear every word, transforming what had started as a private conversation into a very public spectacle that was drawing attention from every corner of the first-class section. The businessman in 2B, a well-dressed man in his 50s who had been reading the financial section of a major newspaper, looked up from his reading material with an expression of irritation that suggested he viewed this disturbance as an unwelcome intrusion on his valuable time. The elderly couple in 1A, distinguished-looking people who carried themselves with the quiet confidence that came from a lifetime of success and social position, exchanged meaningful glances that conveyed their shared disapproval of the situation. The woman in 4C, elegantly dressed and perfectly coiffed in a way that spoke of considerable investment in personal appearance, actually turned in her seat to get a better view of the confrontation, her expression a mixture of curiosity and satisfaction at seeing what she clearly viewed as appropriate enforcement of standards. Marcus felt the familiar surge of frustration that came with these situations, a cocktail of emotions that included disappointment, anger, and a deep sadness that such encounters were still a regular part of his life experience. But he kept his voice level and his demeanor calm, drawing on the lessons his parents had taught him about maintaining dignity in difficult circumstances and the importance of not allowing other people's prejudices to dictate his behavior or emotional state. "Ma'am, those documents are completely legitimate," he said, with the kind of quiet certainty that came from knowing he was telling the absolute truth. "If you'd like to verify them through your computer system, I'm happy to wait while you do so. I'm sure your system can confirm my reservation and payment information within a matter of minutes." But Sarah had already made up her mind about the situation, and no amount of reasonable discussion was going to change her conclusions. In her 12 years with the airline, she had developed what she considered to be a finely tuned sense for spotting troublemakers and people who didn't belong in the exclusive environment she was responsible for maintaining. Everything about this young man screamed problem passenger to her trained eye, from his casual appearance to his calm demeanor that she interpreted as suspicious rather than reassuring. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move to the economy cabin while we sort this out. We can't have unauthorized passengers disrupting the flight before we even take off."
Our legitimate first-class passengers deserve better than this kind of chaos and confusion. The reaction from the other passengers was immediate and varied, creating a buzz of whispered conversations and meaningful looks that rippled through the cabin like waves spreading across a pond. Some passengers nodded in agreement, clearly supporting Sarah's decision to maintain order and protect the exclusive atmosphere they had paid to enjoy. Others looked uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation, shifting uneasily in their seats as they watched the drama unfold. But all of them were watching intently, waiting to see how this unexpected drama would resolve itself and what it might mean for their own travel experience. The businessman in 2B cleared his throat loudly, a sound that conveyed both impatience and authority. "Could we please resolve this quickly?" he said, his tone suggesting that he fully expected Marcus to be the one doing the moving. "Some of us have important meetings to prepare for, and these delays are completely unacceptable."
His words carried the weight of someone accustomed to having his needs prioritized and his schedule respected above all other considerations. The elderly woman in 1A whispered something to her husband that was too quiet for others to hear, but her expression made it clear that she was sharing her disapproval of the situation. Her husband nodded gravely and shot a disapproving look in Marcus's direction, his face conveying the kind of moral certainty that came from a lifetime of clear social hierarchies and unquestioned assumptions about how the world should work. Marcus remained standing beside his seat, his boarding pass still in his hand, and his expression calm despite the growing pressure of the situation and the weight of hostile stares from passengers who had already judged him without knowing anything about his circumstances or character. He had been in similar situations before, though never quite this public or this confrontational, and he understood the dynamics at play better than anyone else in the cabin. He knew that arguing further would only escalate the situation and potentially make things worse for everyone involved, creating the kind of scene that would be remembered long after the flight had ended. But he also knew that he had every right to be in that seat, and giving in to intimidation and prejudice would only encourage more of the same behavior in the future, not just toward him, but toward other passengers who might find themselves in similar circumstances.
"Ma'am," he said, addressing Sarah directly, while keeping his voice calm and respectful despite the provocative nature of the situation. "I understand you're just doing your job, and I respect that. But I'm going to remain in my assigned seat unless you can show me a specific policy or regulation that requires me to move based on your personal assessment of my appearance or background." It was a reasonable request, delivered in a calm tone that emphasized his willingness to work within the system rather than challenge it unnecessarily. But Sarah interpreted his measured response as defiance, as a challenge to her authority and professional judgment that could not be tolerated in front of the passengers she was responsible for serving. In her mind, his refusal to accept her decision was proof that he was, indeed, the kind of troublemaker she had suspected him to be from the beginning. "That's it," she announced to the entire cabin, her voice carrying a note of finality that suggested the situation had moved beyond negotiation or reasonable discussion. "I'm calling security. We clearly have a situation here that requires professional intervention." She reached for the communication device that connected her to ground control and airport security, pressing the button that would summon help to deal with what she characterized as a disruptive passenger who was refusing to cooperate with legitimate crew instructions. "Ground control, this is Skyline Flight 247, she said into the device, her voice carrying clearly throughout the first-class cabin as she made no effort to conduct the conversation privately. "We have a passenger in first class who is refusing to cooperate with crew instructions and disrupting the boarding process. We need security personnel at the aircraft immediately to resolve this situation and remove the disruptive individual." The effect on the cabin was immediate and dramatic, like a stone thrown into a calm pond that created ripples extending in all directions. Some passengers began muttering among themselves about potential delays and missed connections, their frustration evident as they calculated the impact this situation might have on their carefully planned schedules. Others pulled out their phones, either to document the unfolding drama for social media or to text their frustrations and concerns to colleagues and family members who were expecting them to arrive on time. Still others seemed to relish the excitement and drama, treating the situation like entertainment that was far more interesting than the usual routine of air travel. The atmosphere in the cabin, which had been of relaxed anticipation just minutes before, was now tense and uncomfortable, charged with the kind of nervous energy that came from conflict and uncertainty about what might happen next. Marcus felt a familiar knot form in his stomach, the physical manifestation of stress that he had experienced countless times before in similar situations. This was exactly the kind of scene he had hoped to avoid, but it seemed that circumstances and other people's prejudices were conspiring against him once again, forcing him into a public confrontation that he had done nothing to provoke or encourage. He looked around the cabin at the faces watching him, taking in the range of expressions that revealed the complex mix of emotions and judgments that the passengers were experiencing. Some faces showed curiosity about how this unusual situation would resolve itself. Others displayed annoyance at the disruption to their travel plans and the delay it might cause. Still others revealed open hostility, as if he were personally responsible for ruining their premium travel experience simply by existing in a space where they felt he didn't belong. He thought about his options, none of which seemed particularly appealing at that moment. He could continue to stand his ground and wait for security to arrive, which would likely result in an even more public and embarrassing confrontation that might be recorded and shared widely on social media. He could voluntarily move to economy to avoid further drama, but that would mean giving in to discrimination and potentially encouraging more of the same behavior toward other passengers who might find themselves in similar circumstances. Or he could take a third option, one that he had hoped he wouldn't need to use but that might be necessary to resolve the situation with minimal additional embarrassment for everyone involved. Marcus pulled out his phone, a simple device that didn't scream expensive technology, but was actually equipped with capabilities that most of the passengers around him would have found surprising if they had known what to look for. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for, a direct line that bypassed all the usual channels and connected him immediately to someone who had the authority to resolve the situation quickly and definitively. He pressed the call button and waited for the connection, acutely aware that every person in the first-class cabin was watching his every move with intense curiosity about what this unexpected development might mean.
The phone rang once, then twice, and then a familiar voice answered on the other end, warm and professional in a way that immediately made Marcus feel more confident about the situation. "Captain Rodriguez," the voice said, carrying the natural authority that came with years of experience in aviation and leadership roles. "Good morning, Marcus. I was wondering when I'd hear from you." Marcus smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of comfort he had shown since boarding the aircraft, as he heard the voice of someone who knew him well and understood the complexities of his situation. "Good morning, Captain. I'm sorry to bother you, but I think we might have a small situation that could use your attention." "What's going on?" Captain Rodriguez asked, his tone immediately shifting to one of concern as he recognized the subtle tension in Marcus's voice and understood that this wasn't a routine call. Marcus glanced around the cabin, noting that Sarah was standing nearby, clearly trying to overhear his conversation while pretending to organize something in the galley, her body language revealing her growing anxiety about this unexpected development. "One of your flight attendants seems to think I don't belong in first class," Marcus explained quietly, keeping his voice low so that other passengers couldn't easily overhear the details of his conversation. "She's called security and is threatening to have me removed from the aircraft based solely on my appearance and her assumptions about who I am and what I can afford." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and Marcus could practically hear Captain Rodriguez processing this information and considering the implications of what he had just learned. The pause stretched for several seconds, during which Marcus could almost feel the captain's mind working through the situation and its potential consequences. "Sarah Mitchell?" the captain asked, his voice taking on a slightly weary tone that suggested this wasn't the first time he had dealt with issues involving this particular flight attendant. "Tall woman, blonde hair, very particular about maintaining what she considers to be appropriate standards?" Marcus glanced over at Sarah, who was now openly eavesdropping on his conversation with barely concealed anxiety, her professional composure beginning to crack around the edges as she realized that this situation might not be as straightforward as she had initially anticipated. "Sir, who were you just speaking with?" she demanded, her voice carrying a note of authority that was undermined by the slight tremor that suggested she wasn't quite as confident as she was trying to appear. "And I need to inform you that security is on their way," she continued, as if repeating this fact would somehow make her position stronger or more legitimate.
Marcus looked at her calmly, noting the subtle signs of nervousness that were beginning to show through her professional facade. The slight tremor in her voice, the way her hands were fidgeting with her communication device, the frequent glances
toward the aircraft door, as if she were hoping security would arrive soon to validate her decisions. "I was speaking with someone who can help resolve this situation," he said simply, his tone remaining respectful but confident. "I think you'll find that everything will be cleared up very shortly, and we can all get on with our day without further disruption or embarrassment for anyone involved." The next few minutes passed in tense silence that seemed to stretch much longer than the clock indicated. Sarah busied herself with unnecessary tasks in the galley, organizing items that were already perfectly organized and checking systems that had already been checked multiple times. But her frequent glances in Marcus's direction revealed her growing anxiety about the situation and her uncertainty about what the phone call might have set in motion. The other passengers alternated between watching the drama unfold and checking their watches, their body language clearly expressing concern about potential delays that might affect their connecting flights or important appointments. The businessman in 2B had given up any pretense of working on his laptop and was now openly staring at Marcus with undisguised hostility, as if blaming him personally for the disruption to what should have been a routine and pleasant flight experience. The elderly couple in 1A were whispering to each other in hushed tones, occasionally glancing in Marcus's direction with expressions that conveyed their disapproval of the entire situation and their support for Sarah's efforts to maintain appropriate standards in the first-class cabin. Other passengers throughout the cabin were displaying various levels of interest and concern, creating an atmosphere of tension and anticipation that was unlike anything most of them had experienced during routine air travel. Then, from the front of the aircraft, came the sound of footsteps on the jet bridge. Heavy and authoritative footsteps that suggested someone important was approaching the aircraft with purpose and determination. The sound echoed through the enclosed space of the jet bridge, growing louder as the person approached the aircraft door. Sarah looked up from her tasks in the galley, expecting to see airport security personnel who would help her resolve this troublesome situation once and for all, and validate her professional judgment in front of the passengers who had witnessed the entire confrontation. Her expression brightened with anticipation as she prepared to explain the situation to security and receive the support she felt she deserved based on her years of experience and her understanding of company policies and procedures. "Captain Rodriguez," she began, her voice regaining some of her earlier confidence as she prepared to present her case to someone who would understand the importance of upholding company policies,
Maintaining standards and appropriate procedures. "I'm so glad you're here. We have a passenger who is clearly in the wrong seat and refusing to cooperate with reasonable requests. I've already called security as per company protocol," she continued, her words coming faster as she tried to establish her position before anyone else could speak. "But perhaps you can help expedite his removal so we can get this flight back on schedule and avoid further disruption for our legitimate first-class passengers who deserve better than this kind of chaos." Captain Rodriguez turned to look at Sarah, and something in his expression made her growing confidence falter immediately. There was no anger in his face, but there was a gravity and seriousness that suggested this situation was far more significant than she had realized, and that her assumptions about his support might have been completely wrong. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority that commanded attention and respect from everyone in the cabin. "I need to inform you and everyone else in this cabin about something very important that will clarify this entire situation." He paused, looking around at the assembled passengers, all of whom were hanging on his every word with the kind of intense attention usually reserved for emergency announcements or other critical communications. The silence in the cabin was so complete that the slightest sound seemed amplified, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that was almost overwhelming. "The young man you've been trying to remove from seat 3A is Marcus Chen. The captain continued, his words falling like hammer blows in the silent cabin. Mr. Chen is not just a passenger on this aircraft. He is the son of David Chen, who owns 47% of Skyline Airways and serves as chairman of our board of directors. The effect of this announcement was immediate and dramatic, like a thunderclap in a clear sky that completely changed the weather in an instant. Sarah's face went completely white, drained of all color, as if someone had literally pulled the blood from her veins, and she actually staggered backward a step as if she had been physically struck by the revelation. The businessman in 2B dropped his newspaper, the pages scattering as his mouth fell open in shock and his eyes widened with the realization of what he had just witnessed and participated in. The elderly couple in 1A turned to stare at Marcus with expressions of complete astonishment, their previous certainty about the situation completely shattered by this unexpected revelation. Throughout the cabin, passengers were turning to each other with wide eyes and expressions of disbelief, processing this information that completely overturned everything they had assumed about the situation they had been watching unfold. Whispered conversations began immediately, as people tried to make sense of what they had just learned and what it might mean for their own behavior and assumptions. But Captain Rodriguez wasn't finished with his revelations, and his next words would prove even more shocking than what he had already shared. Furthermore, he continued, his voice carrying clearly throughout the now completely silent cabin, Mr. Chen is traveling today in his capacity as a member of our company's Customer Experience Review Board. He regularly travels on our flights, always maintaining a low profile and never identifying himself to assess service quality and passenger treatment under real-world conditions. His reports are reviewed directly by senior management and have resulted in significant policy changes and improvements to our service standards. Sarah felt her knees going weak, and she reached out to steady herself against the nearest seat as the full implications of the situation crashed down upon her like an avalanche. Everything she had assumed about this situation had been completely wrong from the very beginning. Not only had she attempted to remove a legitimate first-class passenger based solely on his appearance, but she had tried to eject a member of the family that owned the airline she worked for. Even worse, she had done so in exactly the kind of situation that he had been specifically tasked to observe and evaluate, and her behavior had been witnessed by multiple passengers who would undoubtedly remember this incident for years to come. The humiliation was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the realization that her career with Skyline Airways was almost certainly over. I want everyone in this cabin to understand something very clearly, Captain Rodriguez continued, his voice taking on an even more serious tone that commanded absolute authority.
Attention from every person present. What happened here today is completely unacceptable and contrary to every value that Skyline Airways represents and has worked to embody throughout our company's history. We pride ourselves on treating every passenger with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, age, background, or any other characteristic that has nothing to do with their status as valued customers who have chosen to fly with us, he said, his words carrying the weight of official company policy and personal conviction. Marcus remained standing quietly beside his seat, his expression calm but watchful as he observed the reactions of everyone around him. He wasn't gloating or showing any satisfaction at Sarah's obvious distress and humiliation. If anything, he looked somewhat sad that the situation had escalated to this point, though he understood that sometimes difficult lessons were necessary to create meaningful change that would benefit future passengers. Captain Rodriguez turned back to Sarah, who was now visibly trembling as the full weight of her mistake became clear not just to her, but to everyone in the cabin. "Ms. Mitchell, I need you to gather your personal belongings immediately," he said, his voice remaining calm, but carrying an unmistakable tone of finality that left no room for argument or negotiation. You are being removed from this flight effective immediately, and there will be a full investigation into this incident when we return to base," he continued. "Your behavior today has violated multiple company policies regarding customer service, discrimination, and professional conduct, and it has created exactly the kind of situation that our training programs are specifically designed to prevent." His words hit her like physical blows, each sentence driving home the magnitude of her error and the consequences that would inevitably follow. She opened her mouth as if to protest, to offer some explanation or justification that might salvage her position, but no sound came out, as she realized that nothing she could say would make this situation any better or undo the damage she had caused. "But Captain," she finally managed to whisper, her voice barely audible as she struggled to find words that might somehow explain her actions in a way that would make them seem reasonable or justified. "I was just trying to maintain standards. He looked—" She trailed off, realizing that nothing she could say would make her behavior seem acceptable or professional. "You thought what, Ms. Mitchell?" Captain Rodriguez asked, his tone remaining calm but implacable as he waited for her to complete her explanation. "That someone's appearance gives you the right to humiliate them in public? That your assumptions about who belongs where are more important than treating people with basic human dignity and following proper verification procedures?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Sarah realized that there was no good answer she could give that would justify her behavior or make the situation any less damaging to her career and reputation. She had acted on prejudice and assumption, rather than following the professional protocols she had been trained to use, and now she was facing the consequences of those choices. The captain turned to address the entire cabin once more, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in leadership positions and understood the importance of clear communication during crisis situations. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally apologize to each and every one of you for witnessing this incident and for the disruption it has caused to your travel experience. This is absolutely not the level of service or professionalism that you should expect from Skyline Airways, and we will be conducting a comprehensive review of our training and procedures to ensure that nothing like this happens again." His words carried the weight of a solemn promise that extended beyond mere corporate damage control to genuine commitment to improvement. Sarah was now openly crying, tears streaming down her face as the full weight of her mistake crashed down upon her like a collapsing building. 12 years of service, a career she had built through dedication and hard work, gone in a matter of minutes because she had made assumptions based on appearance rather than facts. The irony was devastating. She had spent years priding herself on maintaining standards, only to discover that she had become the very thing those standards were meant to prevent. She looked around the cabin at the passengers she had been so eager to protect and serve, many of whom were now looking at her with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disgust. The businessman in 2B, who had seemed to support her actions just minutes before, was now avoiding eye contact and appeared embarrassed to have been associated with the situation. The elderly couple in 1A were whispering to each other with expressions of shock and disapproval that were clearly directed at her, rather than at Marcus.
Captain Rodriguez gestured toward the aircraft door with a movement that was both gentle and inexorable. "Miss Mitchell, you need to leave the aircraft now," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made resistance impossible. "HR will be in contact with you regarding your employment status, but for now, you are suspended pending the outcome of our investigation." Sarah nodded numbly, tears continuing to stream down her face as she realized that her career with Skyline Airways was effectively over, and that this incident would likely follow her for years to come, making it difficult, if not impossible, to find similar employment in the aviation industry. She began gathering her personal belongings with shaking hands, her movements clumsy and uncertain as she struggled to maintain some semblance of professional dignity while her world collapsed around her. As she gathered her things and made her way toward the front of the aircraft, the silence in the cabin was deafening and oppressive. Every passenger watched her walk of shame, and many were already pulling out their phones to document this extraordinary turn of events, understanding that they were witnessing something that would likely become a viral sensation within hours. Sarah paused at the aircraft door, turning back one last time as if hoping this might all turn out to be some sort of terrible nightmare from which she might wake up to find her career and reputation intact. But Captain Rodriguez's expression remained stern and unchanging, offering no hope of reprieve or second chances. "Goodbye, Miss Mitchell," he said simply, his words carrying a finality that made it clear this was indeed the end of her time with Skyline Airways. "Someone from ground crew will escort you to the terminal and ensure that you reach employee services safely." And with that, Sarah Mitchell's 12-year career with Skyline Airways came to an abrupt and humiliating end. After Sarah had left the aircraft, her footsteps echoing down the jet bridge like the sound of a funeral march, Captain Rodriguez turned his attention back to the passengers, particularly those who had been most vocal in their support of her actions and most hostile in their treatment of Marcus. The atmosphere in the cabin was still tense, but now it carried a different quality. The uncomfortable awareness that everyone present had participated in or witnessed something that revealed uncomfortable truths about assumptions and prejudice. "I also want to address the behavior of some passengers during this incident," he said, his gaze settling on the businessman in 2B and several others who had made their disapproval of Marcus clear through their words and body language. His tone remained professional, but there was an edge to it that suggested he was not entirely pleased with what he had observed. "Part of being a Skyline Airways passenger means treating fellow travelers with respect and dignity, regardless of their appearance or your assumptions about their background or circumstances. If you cannot do that, then perhaps you should consider flying with another airline that better matches your expectations and values." His words carried unmistakable weight, and several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they realized that their own behavior was being called into question. The businessman in 2B cleared his throat nervously, his earlier confidence completely evaporated as he found himself on the receiving end of official disapproval. "Captain, I want to apologize," he said, his voice lacking its earlier authority and certainty. "I had no idea. I shouldn't have assumed." His words trailed off as he realized that his lack of knowledge about Marcus's identity wasn't really the point of the captain's criticism. Captain Rodriguez held up a hand to stop him, his gesture firm but not unkind. "Sir, the issue isn't that you didn't know who Mr. Chen was. The issue is that you felt entitled to treat another passenger poorly based solely on his appearance and your assumptions about what kind of person deserves respect. That's something you need to reflect on regardless of who anyone turns out to be, because the way we treat people when we think they have no power or influence reveals our true character more clearly than any other behavior." The businessman nodded slowly, his face flushed with embarrassment, as he began to understand the deeper implications of what the captain was saying. Other passengers throughout the cabin were having similar moments of uncomfortable self-reflection as they considered their own reactions to the situation and what those reactions revealed about their own assumptions and biases.
Captain Rodriguez then walked over to Marcus, who had finally taken his seat and was organizing his belongings in the storage compartment beside him with the calm efficiency of someone who had dealt with similar situations before. The captain's expression softened as he addressed the young man who had handled this difficult situation with remarkable grace and maturity. "Marcus, I am deeply sorry about what happened here today," he said, his voice carrying genuine regret and concern. "This is absolutely not the kind of experience we want any of our passengers to have, let alone someone who is helping us evaluate and improve our service standards. I promise you that we will take comprehensive action to prevent anything like this from happening again," he continued.
This incident will be thoroughly reviewed at the highest levels of our company, and it will result in significant changes to our training programs, hiring practices, and service protocols." Marcus looked up at the captain with a small smile that seemed to carry both forgiveness and understanding. "Thank you, Captain Rodriguez. I appreciate your handling of the situation, though I wish it hadn't been necessary," he said, his calm response seeming to surprise some of the passengers who had perhaps expected him to be more angry or vindictive given what he had just endured. "Your father is going to be very interested to hear about this," the captain continued, his tone carrying the weight of someone who understood the broader implications of what had occurred. "I have a feeling this incident is going to result in some significant changes to our training programs and hiring practices across the entire company." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his expression suggesting that he was already considering the broader implications of the incident and how it might be used to create positive change. "Dad has always believed that how a company treats people when they think no one important is watching reveals their true character," he said, his words carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned important lessons about human nature and organizational behavior. "I think today provided some valuable insights into areas where we need to improve, not just in terms of specific policies and procedures, but in terms of the underlying attitudes and assumptions that drive behavior. This incident, as unfortunate as it was, could become a catalyst for meaningful change that benefits countless future passengers." Captain Rodriguez spent several more minutes ensuring that Marcus was comfortable and that the other passengers understood the gravity of what had occurred and the company's commitment to preventing similar incidents in the future. He also made it clear that anyone who felt uncomfortable flying with Marcus was welcome to take the next available flight, though none of the passengers took him up on that offer, perhaps recognizing that such a request would reveal their own prejudices in an embarrassing way. As the captain prepared to return to the cockpit to complete his pre-flight preparations, he paused to make one final announcement that would set the tone for the remainder of the flight. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that this flight will be documented in detail, and the incident will be reviewed at the highest levels of our company. We take discrimination very seriously at Skyline Airways, and we will use this experience to become better, not just as an airline, but as an organization that truly lives up to its stated values of respect, dignity, and equality for all passengers." His words carried the weight of a solemn commitment that extended far beyond corporate public relations to genuine organizational change. With Captain Rodriguez back in the cockpit and a new flight attendant having been brought aboard to replace Sarah, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin began to slowly return to something approaching normal, though the dynamic had completely changed from what it had been before the incident. However, the tension and awkwardness of what had occurred continued to hang in the air like an invisible cloud that affected everyone present. The businessman in 2B leaned across the aisle with an expression of genuine contrition. "Mr. Chen, I want to apologize for my behavior earlier," he said, his voice carrying a humility that had been completely absent during his earlier interactions. "There's no excuse
For the way I acted, and I hope you can forgive me for jumping to conclusions and treating you disrespectfully." Marcus looked at him with genuine warmth, his response demonstrating the kind of grace and maturity that had characterized his behavior throughout the entire incident. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice carrying no trace of resentment or lingering anger. "We all make mistakes sometimes. The important thing is learning from them and doing better in the future." His gracious response seemed to surprise the businessman, who had perhaps expected a less charitable reaction given the humiliation and disrespect he had witnessed and participated in. The contrast between Marcus's dignified behavior and the assumptions that had been made about him based solely on his appearance was striking and uncomfortable for everyone who had participated in those assumptions. The elderly couple from 1A also approached, the woman looking particularly embarrassed as she struggled to find words that might somehow make up for their earlier behavior. "Young man, "We owe you an apology as well," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "We jumped to conclusions based on nothing more than appearances, and that was wrong of us. We were raised to judge people by their character, not their clothing," her husband added, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was genuinely ashamed of his behavior. "We forgot that lesson today, and we're sorry." Marcus stood to shake their hands, his gesture of respect and forgiveness, creating a moment of human connection that seemed to ease some of the tension in the cabin. "Thank you for saying that," he replied, his words carrying genuine appreciation for their willingness to acknowledge their mistakes and apologize. "I think we can all learn something from what happened here today. Sometimes difficult situations like this one can teach us important lessons about ourselves and our assumptions." Throughout the cabin, similar conversations were taking place, as passengers reflected on their own behavior and assumptions, many of them realizing for the first time how quickly they had been willing to make judgments based solely on appearance, and how those judgments had affected their treatment of another human being. The incident had become an uncomfortable mirror that forced everyone present to confront their own biases and prejudices. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate and began its journey to Los Angeles, the engines humming with the familiar sound that experienced travelers associated with the beginning of their journey, Marcus settled back in his seat and pulled out his book, the same worn paperback that had been in his hands when this entire situation began. The flight attendant who had replaced Sarah, a young man named Kevin, whose demeanor was professional but notably warmer and more respectful than what Marcus had initially encountered, approached with a genuine smile. "Mr. Chen, is there anything I can give for you to make your flight more comfortable?" he asked, his tone carrying the kind of respectful attention that should have been standard from the beginning, but now seemed particularly meaningful given what had occurred. Marcus smiled back, appreciating the young man's professional demeanor and obvious concern for his comfort and well-being. "Just water would be great, thank you," he replied, his tone warm and appreciative. "And thank you for asking. I appreciate the consideration." As Kevin went to get his drink, Marcus reflected on what had just happened and its broader implications. It wasn't the first time his appearance had caused problems, and it probably wouldn't be the last, given the unfortunate persistence of prejudice and assumption in society. But perhaps this incident, as painful and embarrassing as it had been for everyone involved, would help create some positive change that would benefit other passengers in the future who might find themselves in similar circumstances. His phone buzzed with a text message from his father, the notification tone cutting through the ambient noise of the aircraft and drawing his attention away from his philosophical reflections. "Captain Rodriguez called me about the incident. Are you okay? Do you need anything?" The message carried the concern and support that Marcus had always been able to count on from his family, even in difficult situations. Marcus typed back a response that reflected both his resilience and his perspective on the situation. "I'm fine, Dad. Captain Rodriguez handled it very professionally. I think this could be a good learning opportunity for the company and maybe even for the industry as a whole." His father's response was immediate and carried the pride and approval that meant so much to Marcus. "Agreed. We'll discuss it in detail when you get home. I'm proud of how you handled yourself under pressure."
As the flight continued toward Los Angeles, gaining altitude and settling into the routine of cross-country travel, word of the incident began to spread through social media and aviation forums with the kind of viral velocity that characterized controversial events in the digital age. Several passengers had documented parts of the confrontation and Sarah's dramatic exit, and the videos were quickly being shared, commented upon, and analyzed by thousands of people who were eager to weigh in on questions of discrimination, customer service, and social justice. The hashtag #SkylineScandal began trending within hours of takeoff, with people sharing their own stories of discrimination and poor treatment by airline staff, creating a broader conversation about systemic issues in the travel industry and the need for better training and accountability. The incident had tapped into a vein of frustration and anger that extended far beyond the confines of Flight 247 and spoke to larger questions about how people were treated based on their appearance, background, and perceived social status.
By the time Flight 247 landed in Los Angeles several hours later, the runway lights gleaming in the California sunshine, the story had been picked up by major news outlets and was being discussed on television programs, radio shows, and countless online forums. Skyline Airways found itself facing intense scrutiny over its hiring and training practices, with many people calling for systematic reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future and ensure that all passengers were treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or background. Marcus deplaned quietly, avoiding the reporters who had already gathered at the airport, hoping to get a statement from him or additional details about what had occurred during the flight. He had never sought attention or publicity from these situations, preferring to handle them quietly and use them as learning opportunities rather than public spectacles that might generate more heat than light. However, the impact of what had happened on Flight 247 was just beginning to be felt throughout the aviation industry and beyond. Within days, Skyline Airways announced a comprehensive review of all customer service procedures, with particular attention to unconscious bias and discrimination prevention. The company committed to implementing new training programs, revising hiring practices, and creating accountability mechanisms that would prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future and ensure that all passengers were treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or background. Sarah Mitchell's employment was officially terminated after a thorough investigation that revealed a pattern of behavior that violated company policies and values. She became something of a cautionary tale within the aviation industry, her name associated with the kind of discriminatory behavior that companies were working to eliminate through better training and more rigorous screening of employees who interacted with customers. The incident also sparked broader conversations about discrimination in air travel and the importance of treating all passengers with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, age, background, or perceived social status. Many airlines began reviewing their own policies and procedures, recognizing that similar incidents could happen to them if they weren't proactive about addressing these issues and creating cultures of inclusion and respect. Professional associations within the aviation industry use the incident as a case study for training programs and policy development, recognizing that it illustrated important principles about customer service, bias prevention, and the consequences of making assumptions based on appearance rather than facts. The story became a teaching tool that helped countless employees understand the importance of treating every customer with professionalism and respect. For Marcus, the flight served as another reminder of the challenges that came with his unique position in society and the responsibility that came with his family's influence and resources. As the son of a prominent business owner, he had access to privileges and opportunities that most people could only dream of. But his humble appearance and quiet demeanor often led people to make incorrect assumptions about him, sometimes with embarrassing and painful results. He had learned over the years that these situations, while unpleasant and sometimes humiliating, provided valuable insights into how businesses really operated when they thought no one important was watching. The way Sarah had treated him revealed systemic problems within Skyline Airways that needed to be addressed, and his father's company was now committed to making the necessary changes to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future and ensure that all passengers were treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or background. The story of Flight 247 became a case study in business schools and customer service training programs across the country, used to illustrate the importance of treating every customer with respect and dignity, regardless of their appearance or perceived status. It also demonstrated how quickly a situation could escalate when employees made assumptions
Rather than following proper procedures, and how the consequences of discriminatory behavior could extend far beyond the immediate incident to affect entire organizations and industries. Sarah Mitchell, meanwhile, struggled to find new employment in the aviation industry after her termination became public knowledge. The incident had been so widely publicized that her name had become synonymous with discrimination and poor customer service, making it difficult for her to find work in her chosen field.
She eventually found employment in a different industry, but the experience served as a painful reminder of the consequences of letting prejudice override professionalism and the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. The broader impact of the incident extended far beyond Skyline Airways and even beyond the aviation industry. Other service industries began examining their own practices and training programs, recognizing that similar situations could arise in any context where employees interacted with customers from diverse backgrounds. The incident became a catalyst for conversations about unconscious bias, discrimination prevention, and the importance of creating inclusive environments where all customers felt valued and respected. Industry organizations developed new standards for customer service that emphasized respect and dignity for all passengers, and training programs were revised to include specific modules on bias recognition and prevention. The incident had revealed gaps in existing training and accountability systems that needed to be addressed across the entire industry, not just at Skyline Airways. Marcus continued to travel regularly for both business and pleasure in the months and years that followed, and while he occasionally encountered situations that echoed what had happened on Flight 247, he noticed that airline staff seemed generally more professional and respectful in their interactions with all passengers. The changes that had been implemented as a result of the incident appeared to be having a positive effect, suggesting that the lessons learned from that difficult experience had indeed led to meaningful improvements. When asked about the incident during business conferences and speaking engagements, Marcus reflected on the experience with characteristic thoughtfulness and maturity. "What happened that day was unfortunate for everyone involved," he would say, his words carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned to find meaning and opportunity in difficult circumstances. "But it created an opportunity for positive change that has benefited countless passengers since then," he would continue. "Sometimes it takes a dramatic incident to reveal problems that have been hiding in plain sight. The important thing is how we respond to those revelations and what we do to prevent similar problems in the future." The story of Flight 247 remained a powerful reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that treating people with dignity and respect should never depend on knowing who they were or what they might be capable of doing in response. It showed that discrimination and prejudice could have serious consequences, not just for the individuals directly involved, but for entire organizations and industries that failed to address these issues proactively. In the end, the incident that began with Sarah Mitchell's assumptions about a young man in a hoodie became a catalyst for positive change that benefited countless passengers in the years that followed. It proved that sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected sources, and that treating everyone with respect and dignity wasn't just the right thing to do morally, it was also good business that created loyalty, trust, and positive outcomes for everyone involved.